Coming up on today's show, Bitcoin, M-Pesa, and Kenya, courtesy of GenesisBlock.com. What is microlending and how does it work? It's not that simple. Life is the largest Canadian exchange with Joseph David, CEO of CA Vertex. 16 bribes a month. Is corruption just developing world tipping? Mutually beneficial mesh networking on your smartphone with Stanislav Sholanov, CTO of Open Garden. The origins of M-Pesa and what are Bitcoin's chances in Kenya really? If you're new to Bitcoin, check out letstalkbitcoin.com/learn to be directed to the Bitcoin Education Project. If you like what we're doing, please review us on iTunes or your preferred podcast platform. This helps others find the show, but just generally we really appreciate it. We do an hour-long show twice a week. That's a lot of content, and it can be overwhelming to new listeners. I'm excited to announce a brand new tool to help share the show called GivePodcast.com. Using your phone, just take a screenshot of your podcast player at the time you want to share, email the image to clip@givepodcast.com with the description in the subject and the email address of the friend you'd like to send it to. The service grabs a 10-minute clip of the show starting from the time indicated by the screenshot, hosts it, and emails it to your friend in a nice clean format. This is an experiment. Please give it a try and tell us what you think. Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk Bitcoin, a twice-weekly show focused on the ideas, projects, and people building the new digital economy and the future of money. My name is Adam B. Levine. I'm a writer and speaker who likes to talk about complicated topics in understandable terms. Joining me in our twice-weekly search for clarity, Andreas M. Antonopoulos is an expert in distributed systems and decentralized networks.
Hello.
Dr. Stephanie Murphy is a scientist and syndicated radio host.
Hello.
The potential of cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin in Africa is an issue we've talked about on this show quite a bit. And in fact, I've coined the term Bitcoin is for the other 6.5 billion. It's something I feel very strongly about. Recently, Noel Jones, writing for one of our favorite blogs, the Genesis Block, wrote a great piece explaining how specifically Kenya would benefit immensely from such adoption if only they knew. So from the article. Kenya. Africa today has one of the fastest growing mobile phone markets in the world with 20% annual growth and 93% of Kenyan households owning mobile phones. What makes Kenya a particularly unique case for Bitcoin is that it is also a world leader in mobile payment usage. In 2007, Safaricom, one of Kenya's leading telecommunication companies, launched a mobile payment service called M-Pesa, and it's something we've talked about quite a bit on this show. Back to the article. Today, 2/3 of Kenyans use the service and more than 30% of Kenya's GDP flows through it. The benefits to the Kenyan population are astounding as well, with M-Pesa's rural adoption often seeing dramatic income increases after adopting the program. What do you guys think about M-Pesa Kenya and the opportunity for Bitcoin in those environments?
M-Pesa seems to be working pretty well for a lot of people in Kenya and other parts of Africa. And perhaps it's because a lot of people have mobile phones and they're using basically this SMS-based mechanism to send small payments around. I think that they've already been used to this concept of using their phones to send money and to send small amounts of money. So perhaps Bitcoin would be excellent for them. You know, microlending is another thing that I think of when I think of the developing world. And Bitcoin makes microlending so super easy. It doesn't require these big websites and things to administrate. It's kind of just like you can make a fund and it's really easy to send payments to people and to pay it back. So
when you say microlending, let's actually talk about that for a second. What does that mean in a nutshell?
Microlending is basically the issuance of small loans to individuals or groups of borrowers in the developing world. Typically, most beneficiaries of microlending are actually women or groups of women that are looking to start their own small businesses. Those loans can be backed by, for instance, people in the developed world, and there are many different variations and twists on it. Generally considered the first microlending institution was this bank called Grameen Bank, and that was, Muhammad Yunus, I want to say, got the Nobel Peace Prize for Grameen Bank because they were doing these small loans. And that's the thing in the developing world, because people don't usually have collateral. They don't usually have ways to get credit. They don't have a credit history. And so it's really challenging to think about issuing them a loan. But microlending is specifically for those types of borrowers. And as far as having those loans be paid back without credit history or without collateral, which is people often don't have. Lending to groups enables sort of like a social pressure kind of incentive to pay it back, or like a group sort of assurance that the loan will be repaid. So it's really helped a lot of people in the developing world. I mean, there are definitely critics of it too, who say things like abusive husbands will like use their wives to get credit essentially, or like if they can't pay it back, sometimes like people will commit suicide and things like that. So it's got a couple of critics, but overall, I think a lot of people recognize that it has actually helped spur economic development in some places in the world where there weren't those options before microlending came about.
Do you know if anybody is doing this in the Bitcoin space yet? Because I mean, you're totally right. That seems like that's a really, really natural. It's a really natural venue.
I'm involved in microlending quite a bit. I've used two services. One is more oriented towards peer-to-peer lending, which is more the Western or developed world. And you can find services like that on Lending Club and Prosper.com, etc. But in terms of microlending, one of the services I use extensively for a big chunk of my savings is Kiva, Kiva.org.
Me too. I use Kiva too.
So, Stephanie, you'll like this. I've started an effort to persuade Kiva to use Bitcoin.
Yes. Great.
And I've sent them a number of emails. I haven't received a response back. I'm trying to create a little petition, perhaps on one of the petition sites, to persuade them to start accepting Bitcoin. There are some obvious significant advantages to using Bitcoin in that environment, including the fact that a big chunk of their cost is the aggregation and transfer of the funds overseas with wire transfers and things like that.
They have to partner with these local intermediaries. Basically, Kiva is not peer-to-peer lending. It's basically they broker, as I understand it, a loan that's given by a local bank, but is funded or guaranteed by donors to Kiva.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not necessarily about cutting out the intermediary, because these local organizations, many of them charitable organizations as well, are responsible for distribution, for finding the borrowers, for helping the borrowers create a profile and tell their story and translating their story, etc., but also collecting the payments and being able to keep the system sustainable. Here's one very interesting thing. On Lending Club, I'm mostly lending to Americans. On Kiva, I'm mostly lending to people in developing countries who are much, much, much poorer. Guess who defaults more?
The Americans?
Yep. So the default...
Oh, interesting.
The default rate on my Kiva loans is about half the rate on Lending Club, which, by the way, even the Lending Club default rate is quite low, and it still gives me a fantastic return. Kiva, I don't get a return. It gets funneled back into charity, so you don't make money off it. But it's really interesting. The default rate is much lower. That's an impressive testament to the fact that when you give opportunities like this to people who don't have the opportunities, together with the peer pressure of community loans and things like that, it's actually a very effective way to distribute and get money to where it's needed.
Could Ripple be a medium for Bitcoin microlending, or do you guys know of any specific websites that are only for Bitcoin microlending at this point in time?
There's a lot of, at least I've seen 3 different sites that do Bitcoin peer-to-peer lending, but none of them really micro-lending. And I think the big challenge there is a matter of having infrastructure partners who are able to distribute these loans, which is why I'm trying, rather than building it from scratch, essentially trying to get Kiva.org to adopt Bitcoin, because they already have the infrastructure, the connections, and thousands of needy borrowers. It's much better to convert that.
I'm real curious here. I do not participate in microlending. Andreas, what type of amounts are you talking about on like a per loan basis? I mean, like when you're talking about the Kiva, are we talking about like $50, $200, $1,000?
The loans range from about $200 to about $3,000 or $4,000, and usually the larger loans involve groups of borrowers. The uses of the loans range. At first, you might be a bit surprised. People may think that these loans are really kind of investment loans, like help Hussein buy a taxi so he can increase his taxi business, or help Jimmy get a motorcycle so he can distribute cell phones to his customers or whatever. But a lot of it is also just plain old consumer loans, right? And if you think about it, consumer loans are just as important in this environment because they create liquidity. So sometimes it's help so-and-so buy a new TV, and that's fine too.
Individual lenders or funders can contribute as low as, I think, $25 increments on Kiva.
Yeah, I do all of my loans. I have a limit of 25 is the maximum I'll do to any one lender. And then it's basically crowdsourced. So you have enough people dropping in $25 that the loans get funded pretty quickly, in fact.
So I just did some research on this real quick, and I searched for Bitcoin microlending. There's actually a website called btcjam.com that is peer-to-peer Bitcoin microlending. And so basically it can be a borrower or an investor. The borrowers can define like basically the parameters of the loan, like the interest rate they're willing to pay. There's an optional soft credit check and a peer-to-peer reputation system that goes along with this. Investors get some perks as well. So that might be something that's coming out, but I hadn't heard about it yet.
I've used it. So I unfortunately have some bad news to offer there because I have used BTC Jam, and I find the concept and the premise.
Did you get yourself in a jam?
I got myself in a bit of a jam. I think the concept is brilliant. I think the execution is not quite there yet. So my default rate on BTC Jam was 75%.
Wow.
That compares to 7% on Lending Club and about 3% on Kiva. Here's the problem. It's an anonymous currency. There's a soft credit check. As you said, many of the accounts are linked only by meager information. So caveat emptor for sure. But at the same time, here's the problem. When one of those loans went default, there was absolutely nothing in terms of recourse. BTC Jam didn't even respond to emails. In fact, this is hilarious. You can't put a negative review against one of the borrowers unless you have sufficient reviews yourself as a borrower. Well, I'm not a borrower. I was a lender. I had no reviews against my account, so I couldn't essentially put a negative review against the people who had defaulted. And they went out and took out more loans. So, whoops. Badly structured. But, I mean, look, the idea is great.
Thank you for sharing that experience. I think it's really important for people to know.
I think I didn't have the greatest experience because it's still very much a beta attempt. And I wish them all the luck in the world if they can learn from those experiences and improve them. I was very much willing to lose that money. I probably put in maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4 Bitcoin, not a huge amount, just to try it out. I'm not upset about it. And in fact, I hope they're able to improve the service because it's a brilliant service that's absolutely needed in Bitcoin.
It's like when you make a loan to your cousin. Don't loan him anything that you wouldn't consider a gift.
Well, I can always track my cousin down and kick him in the nuts.
That's true. You can't do that with a Bitcoin address.
Joining me this morning is Joseph David, CEO of CA Vertex, a Canadian exchange, and you're actually the largest player in the Canadian space these days, right?
Yes, we are the single largest in Canada with $20 million traded since inception. Of course, the majority of that's been in our second year when Bitcoin really started taking off. But yes, we're the only ones in Canada.
We talk a lot about the regulatory situation in the U.S., and I had a conversation with Zach from the Lamassu Bitcoin vending machine, and they're kind of in a similar situation where there are different regulations in the United States than there are in Canada. And actually, he said that it's actually much better in Canada. They're taking a lighter touch with the regulatory side. Paint us a picture of what it's like operating an exchange in Canada these days.
I'm glad you're actually getting this directly from me because it's a little bit inaccurate when people make comments like that. What really hit us and the media lately has been that article that has been circulating the web where they even imply that Canada is a safe haven for Bitcoin exchanges, and the Canadian regulatory authorities don't really view it the same way. And what's really actually happening is FINTRAC, the regulatory body in Canada that monitors money transfers of any kinds and deals with anti-money laundering regulations as well as KYC, know your customer regulations, they have ruled that Bitcoin is a barter instrument and that Bitcoin exchanges do not need to be registered as a money service business. However, the banks is what really matters here, okay? The banks do not take direction from FINTRAC, okay? That's extremely important to understand. When we're trying to operate in Canada, we have to satisfy the banking requirements. And as far as the banks are concerned and the world is concerned when it comes to Bitcoin, everyone is very new to it. They don't know what it is. It's a big, huge gray area. It's a big, long story. There's no simple explanations to give them of exactly what a Bitcoin is. So what they see right away when you look at Bitcoin and Canadian dollars being deposited and withdrawn is they just see risk, right? They just see an unknown. And because of that unknown, they say no before they say yes. Basically, we have to approach the bank in a proactive stance. we have to approach the bank and build those relationships from the beginning like we have by saying things like, we have a legal team. We're proactive with regulatory front. We actually want the Canadian government to recognize us and tax us. Please tax us. GST is a big one, for example. In Canada, we have a goods and service tax, and there's these big, long investigations that have to go on does your business need to be registered with GST? Do you need to pay taxes to the government? It's like a goods and service tax. And instead of waiting for a ruling, we're proactive. We collect it and remit it now. So it's things like that we're doing that's showing the bank that we are serious about being proactive. And we're saying no to customers, by the way, that want to deposit large amounts of cash and bypass all these mechanisms. This is where it gets tricky. Even though FINTRAC says, no problem, you don't need to follow these rules, we are following them. And we are saying no to customers and actually turning customers away that want to bypass the rules and regulations. So explaining all of this to the banks gives us that edge and lets us operate. And of course, the whole main reason we're operation right now with the banks is because we actually have that money service business license through our investor and business partner, TAPE International. So they are a registered money service business. They are collecting our payments and remitting our payments to customers and satisfying all FINTRAC and AMF requirements.
Essentially, you're complying with regulations that you don't need to comply to, not to satisfy the regulators, but to satisfy the banks, because otherwise they don't want to do business with you. Is that right?
You have it exactly. That's exactly what is happening here in Canada.
See, that's really interesting, because that actually strikes me as being almost a complete, it's the same situation in the U.S. because, so I had a conversation with Jared Kenna of Trade Hill, which kind of takes it the other way. They say, okay, well, because we're so concerned with compliance and we're so concerned that the rules are going to change further out, we're turning away customers who have less than $10,000 that they want to spend on this. So you're actually taking the complete opposite approach to it. And again, their concern isn't the banks. Their concern is with the regulatory structure, where they're concerned the regulations are going to change and become harsher at a later point, and in doing so, essentially retroactively make their actions in the past not work, unless they do this proactive. Are you concerned about the regulatory system changing, or is this really just about the banks for you?
Well, again, because we're proactive, we want the regulatory system to change. We want the regulatory body to be formed in Canada. We have the ambitious goal of being part of that movement. I would like nothing better than to be on the board of directors of the new regulatory agency in Canada that governs and regulates digital currencies. We have a really interesting development on that front, if I may tell you about it. This is very, very groundbreaking stuff here in Canada. Is the Canadian government has something called the Mint Chip Project. And the Mint Chip is actually a digital currency in Canada, created with a Crown Corporation, which just means government corporation here in Canada, and run by the Canadian government, endorsed by the Royal Canadian Mint. And it is being used as a testing the waters type sample project right now. So it's not a currency you can buy right now and use in circulation in Canada. They're on the beginning stages of introducing this as a testing digital currency in Canada. So you'll be able to go to any Canadian bank, for example, and change Canadian dollars into mint chips. And to follow that even further, mint chips into bitcoins. Wouldn't that be amazing?
Yeah.
So there's some interesting stuff going on in Canada.
When you talk about wanting to be part of the regulatory structure that you're trying to incentivize the creation of, basically, in your mind, is this an industry group that is self-regulating exchanges and self-regulating, or is this actually a government regulatory body that you would want to be a part of, and so actually be part of the government in that way?
In your first scenario of some kind of self-regulating industry group, that would eventually merge into a government body. So I don't know what steps it's going to take. I foresee it starting with an industry self-regulation group and then going toward government. But I don't think you can stop the government. There's no stopping the government noticing this. As Bitcoin gets bigger in Canada, as more and more people start using it, the government is going to notice. For example, one of my ambitious plans that we're starting very shortly here in the next month is to sign up try to sign up every online Canadian merchant that accepts online payments to add a Bitcoin shopping cart checkout button to their webpage. This, I think, is the best way to educate the public, because we have to remember something here about Bitcoin. Just, we both know about it. We're both following this. But I estimate that a large majority of the population doesn't even know what a Bitcoin is. So there's a lot of people that still have no clue what's going on in the whole Bitcoin revolution. So the best way, I think, to get the word out there is to get on that shopping cart checkout site. So all these customers that are going along their daily activity of purchasing goods online see this thing called a Bitcoin checkout beside Visa, MasterCard, and PayPal. And then they see the price difference, okay, $100 on Visa, MasterCard, and PayPal, $95 on Bitcoin checkout. And then they ask themselves a question, why is it cheaper in Bitcoin, and what is a Bitcoin? And that's where I think we're going to be starting to spread like wildfire. That's going to ignite the government, I think, a little bit when they start seeing a majority of online Canadian business add this alternate currency to their checkout.
You mentioned the Mint chip earlier in our conversation. The Mint chip is something that popped up a couple of years ago, and I actually wasn't aware it was getting any traction. With the Mint chip, is this a cryptocurrency or is it just a digital currency? I mean, does it have any of the advantages that Bitcoin does?
Yes, it does. I don't know too much about it, but I know enough to know that it is controlled. Like even if it is a cryptocurrency or digital currency, however they want to do this, it is controlled. There's a server somewhere with a balance of Mint chips on it. So you could change that balance very easily. Of course, you can't do that with Bitcoin. So it has similarities to Bitcoin in the sense that it can be transmitted digitally online, but I think that's where the similarities end.
Paint me a picture here. What's the winning scenario? You know, if you're successful with your ambitious plans, what does the landscape look like in a year or 2 years?
The winning scenario is to be officially recognized by the Canadian government to have a license to operate, to require a license to have operation. Because right now we have a lot of Wild West cowboy type operations that think they can just start a Bitcoin exchange, open up corporate accounts, don't even worry about money service business licenses, and accept payments through all kinds of forms that actually make the industry and make the exchange space in Canada look bad. Ideally, I'd want an operating environment where a license is required to operate, guidelines have to be followed, government regulations are satisfied when it comes to money in and money out. Official recognition and a license would be ideal operating status.
In this winning scenario, what that gives to you is the willingness then and the trust of not only banks but of big business to participate in the system and to accept the system because this type of scenario where you have a regulatory structure and a licensing structure lends legitimacy to it in the eyes of the government. Is that right?
It does. And then it also makes our banking relationships a lot easier. Another big headline news and a very big development in Canada here has been the bank shutdown. Everyone's focusing on bank shutdowns. Banking network in Canada is very different in the States. We have 6 major banks. Then we have credit unions that are part of one major network. But we don't have these private banks and these third-party banks like the U.S. does. So in Canada, when we started, your only choices for major banks are TD, Scotiabank, Bank of Montreal, CIBC, Royal Bank. So I just listed to you some of the major banks. We have HSBC and ING and other ones, but those 5 ones are pretty much the major banks. So the thing with those banks is when we started with them, we started accepting cash deposits at those banks. And then the banks started shutting us down one by one. Every single bank I've just listed to you has shut us down for cash deposits. Okay. Right. And that's because, again, of their concern over AML, not over fraud, because you can't commit fraud by depositing cash and then 5 minutes later going back to the teller and saying, I didn't deposit that cash. So their concern was not the fraud aspect. It was the AML aspect and the KYC, the know your customer aspect. Now in the U.S., look at the landscape. It's much different. You have a company like BitInstant that allows cash deposits across the U.S. at something like 7,000 different banks. So that's very surprising and shocking to me that kind of activity is allowed in the U.S. but not allowed in Canada. And the reason it's not allowed in Canada, again, back to my original point, is because banks think it's a big gray area. They don't have an easy answer to cash, so they shut cash down. Now, the point to my whole statement here is that you don't have to deal with us in cash. There are other ways to deal with us. Okay, the major way right now is online bill payments and direct deposit and direct withdrawal to your Canadian bank account. Now, that is something the bank does allow under a money service business license. So that is what we're doing now. We have multiple ways that we're going to increase that. We're going to have multiple avenues where we might even actually get back into cash. But the key message here, of course, is that you have to satisfy regulations on one hand, but at the same time, you have to educate the banks and not push it too far. You know, they're letting us do online bill payments and direct deposit, direct withdrawal, but they're stopping and cutting us off on the cash.
You said AML, anti-money laundering, right?
Yeah.
The question we keep coming back to with the banks is whether or not it's ignorance, you know, they don't understand this, and so therefore there's no incentive for them to take it, or if it's actually fear, because a lot of people feel like some of the fundamental technologies and some of the fundamental things that Bitcoin does and enables sort of obsolete banking. So, I mean, of course, moving forward, do you think that this is something that's going to change banking and therefore there's resistance to it from that angle? Or do you think that it's simply a knowledge gap?
Let's first understand again that the banks, back to your question about fear, the banks don't know what this is. So it's not knowing plus a combination of fear. Banks are very risk adverse, right? They're extremely risk adverse, especially here in Canada, where we have the government. They're called crown corporations. Corporations run by the government of Canada. They're under specific mandates to not take on any kinds of risky business whatsoever. When you walk into a Canadian bank, there's actually a sheet they give you that says if you are this type of business, and they actually list them, don't even bother applying for a bank account. They're very risk adverse. It's going to take a long time, I think, to have the banks in Canada come around and to educate on the payment method of cash. But let's not forget here what they're doing. They're already allowing current state. And current state is, as long as the money flows through a money service business that is licensed, and as long as proper due diligence is being performed, and as long as the relationship, the personal relationship that they have with me and my legal team and my lawyers, and that is all solid and intact, they allow us to operate. Okay? So it's going to take the government of Canada, I think, to step in and say, we're going to recognize the Bitcoin and we're going to let this, we're going to give them a license, and then I can take that license to the bank and say, with this license, I want to add on cash, and I want to add on this, and I want to add on that. It's going to take the government and the licensing agencies to make the banks change their minds, I think. The Canadian Revenue Agency, Canada Revenue Agency, CRA, did actually rule that any capital gains on Bitcoin transactions must be reported. And that is a ruling, and we are following that internally as a company, and we are answering that to any customer that asks that question.
It seems like the ability to control and exert regulatory force over cryptocurrency is kind of difficult because of just the way it's built. Outside of these limited exchanges, because you're one of the major exchanges, you are the major exchange left in Canada, and there are a few other small ones, but you could count them on two hands. I'm trying to figure out how possible it is to regulate Bitcoin outside of the exchanges, because the exchanges are the choke points.
I think it is possible. I think it's very possible because, and this actually relates perfectly to the comment I want to make here. This is an extremely important point in any country. And that's why I'm really interested about what happened in Italy. I really should read up back on that. But from what I remember on what happened, I think it was either Italy or France, but I think it was Italy, tried to shut down Bitcoin exchanges very early in Bitcoin world. Were you aware of this?
I was not, no.
This is just from my memory long ago, back in year one, actually in probably month 7 of really the Bitcoin climb past around the $20 area. So the Italian government tried to shut Bitcoin exchange down. They succeeded. A couple months went by. Something got appealed. The exchange owners went to the Supreme Court and appealed the decision, and then it got overturned. And Bitcoin is allowed to operate. That was a long time ago, though, so things may have changed now. But that brings me to my point. Could very simply and very easily decide that they just want to shut the exchanges down. They could simply phone up the banks and say, whoever's doing Bitcoin exchange, shut them down. It's illegal. We're going to just make it illegal. The government can do that. That is one avenue the government can go. The second, of course, is everything we've just been discussing. Legalizing it, getting it regulated, recognizing it, taxing it. That's avenue 2. But if we just talk about avenue 1 for a second here, the government could just step in and pull the plug. If that does happen, Canadians would have no choice then but to go offshore, to go deal in a different country, take their money offshore somehow. What would our action plan be? That's one of the things I struggle with every day. Would we take our servers offshore as well and continue with our customer base and try to service Canadians? Well, of course we can't do that. The government makes it illegal and starts seizing physical locations. That's really how the government could step in here. And that really is a concern for me in the Bitcoin space, not just for Canada, but for the world. You have U.S. politicians and senators that are against it, that are on record publicly saying this is not good. Right? Bitcoin has an image problem. And that's another thing I want to address is Bitcoin's image problem. It always comes up how you can buy drugs and guns and sex and all this stuff with Bitcoins. Well, you can do the same thing with cash, by the way. That's what people leave out, is that just like Bitcoin has an image problem, it's got the exact same issue that cash does. That's why to a lot of people I explained that Bitcoins are like digital cash. That's a very easy explanation of what a Bitcoin is. It is like digital cash. So that's sort of my ongoing concern is the government could just step in and say, we're shutting you down. That's where it could go.
You're actually kind of in the mix with this. So what do you think the chances are, relative? I mean, obviously this is totally off the cuff. What do you think the chances are of Avenue A versus Avenue B?
Right now, today, because we're so early in Bitcoin, the revolution, as I call it, is just beginning here. We're very early in it. The chance of Avenue A of the government shutting us down, I think, is very, very low. Again, very few people even know we're out there. But as things progress here in the next year, as we get the merchant signups happening, as we start educating business owners about how Bitcoin is really a way better payment method than anything they've ever seen ever, that's when the government might start to take notice. But if you want my personal prediction, I really hesitate to give predictions, especially being CEO and everyone being able to go back in time and listening to my comments and saying he's making all these predictions. I'm always cautioned by my advisors not to make predictions, but I may make an exception and make a prediction in this case. What do you think?
I think that if you want to, that's fine. The reality is that this is such a complicated topic. I think that predictions are just guesses. So, that's how we treat them. We make predictions all the time.
They're just hunches and guesses. I'll give you mine if you want it. So I think we are going to go to Avenue B. I think the government's going to recognize that we need to be taxed, we need to be regulated, that if they try to make it illegal, that it'll just create a lot more problems than it'll solve. If one world government steps down and puts the gavel down and says Bitcoins are illegal in this country, other countries may either follow suit, they may have their own rules, so then of course citizens will flock to the other country. A long story short, my hunch and my personal guess is that the governments are not going to make it illegal. They're simply going to tax it heavily and try to regulate it heavily.
I'm on record for, saying that by the end of the year, we're going to see congressional hearings on this within the United States, talking about specifically Bitcoin and then cryptocurrencies broadly as well. Do you think that there's a timeline like that for Canada, or do you think that it's just unpredictable at this point?
Nowhere near it. I wouldn't even venture to say within the year. Again, because it's so new, because they hardly know about it, I don't think it's even a topic of conversation. There might be a couple MLAs in Canada, members of Legislative Assembly, that even know that Bitcoin exists. We actually contacted some of them, and their response has been, wow, this sounds like a new, interesting thing, and then they just take weeks to get their head wrapped around it, right, and don't return our phone calls. It's so new here that I don't think it's going to happen this year.
Joseph David, CA Vertex, thank you very much.
Thank you for the interview.
Let's Talk Bitcoin is heard each week by thousands of people who are participating in the new digital economy. Our listener base of Bitcoin owners, miners, investors, technologists, and merchants is growing fast. We offer a limited number of short advertising slots in each show to keep our listeners engaged and to provide maximum impact for our sponsors. If you'd like to talk to us about Let's Talk Bitcoin, send us an email at sponsors@letstalkbitcoin.com.
If I showed you a website where you could easily purchase electronics from the world's largest distributor with Bitcoins at 0% markup, would you think it was too good to be true? Good news, it's real, and it's at bitcoinstore.com. Choose from 500,000 items, save money over Amazon and Newegg, and convert your Bitcoins to real-world items. You can even buy with privacy. All they need is a shipping address. But don't take my word for it. See for yourself at bitcoinstore.com.
Let's get back to the article. Despite having a robust mobile payment network with M-Pesa, Kenya is still subject to a slew of economic issues such as corruption, inflation, and remittance costs. Kenya faces high corruption costing more than $1 billion per year, or approximately 3% of their GDP, with individual Kenyans paying an estimated 16 bribes per month. M-Pesa has not avoided this trend, with 114 cases of fraud in 2011 alone, resulting in millions lost. A protocol like Bitcoin, which removes vulnerability to human corruption, would likely be a welcome entrant into the world of mobile payments. M-Pesa also comes at a cost to its users, with Safaricom's fees ranging from 1 to 10% for money transfers. Users are losing value to a centralized entity with every transaction. On top of that, the Kenyan government recently began taxing M-Pesa transfers, which will further increase costs by 10%. Another substantial benefit that Bitcoin has over M-Pesa is with regards to inflation. Only in the last year, Kenya has somewhat stemmed inflation after reaching peak rates above 30% in 2008. Though concerns linger with regards to Bitcoin's volatility compared to developed market currencies, the relative consistency of Bitcoin could be a welcome change in less stable regions.
I think there's a dangerous tendency for geeks to try to assume technological solutions to social problems. Corruption is not a technology issue, it's an institutional and political issue. And it occurs because of widespread problems in a society and the lack of institutional controls to solve those problems. I've lived in corrupt societies. I know what it's like to pay bribes. And the problem is that when it becomes so entrenched into the culture, it's very difficult to resist, even if you absolutely want to. You know, if you can't get your driver's license, even if you can pass the test and can drive well, because the bribe is required. So, you know, you have to. You can't get a doctor's appointment unless you bribe the doctor. You can't get your paperwork done unless you bribe the bureaucrat. So essentially you succumb to this pressure. Technology won't change that. You'll just bribe people in Bitcoin. In fact, if anything, it might make it easier because frictionless commerce also means frictionless bribes, right? I'm not necessarily convinced that technology is the solution here. But at the same time, I think Bitcoin would be a fantastic fit in many developing countries. Just like M-Pesa, it offers immediate person-to-person transactions with very little technology, perhaps, especially if we can adapt it to using SMS. The standard should be, can it work on a Nokia 2100, you know, a phone from 10 years ago? Because that's really the technology base in these countries.
16 bribes per month, though, per person. I mean, that's like...
Nothing.
Really? I mean, that's small. See, I have no concept of this. I'm totally, you know, I'm California born and raised. So, I mean, this is not something I have any experience with. That's a small amount for a country like this?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. 16 bribes a month is nothing. I mean, if you go to India, it's probably 16 bribes a day. Seriously, this is the norm for the rest of the world. It's very easy to see things from a different perspective if you're born and raised here in the States. This is the norm for the rest of the world. This is what oils the machine of state. This is how bureaucracies work. And this is how most people in the developing world who have any measure of authority, this is how they get paid. This is their salary. They don't make much getting paid by the government or by the fees they collect. So essentially you have this entire shadow economy. It's almost like tipping. So the way tipping works in the US, and most foreigners don't get it, is, oh wait, you have to pay 20% on top of every payment for the service. Well, that's not corruption, but in other countries, corruption works in exactly the same way. You know, you assume that people are not making much on their government salary, and therefore it's normal for them to collect a small extra fee. It's almost like a tip, and it's in the form of a bribe. It's no different than that.
It's not like a tip. It's not. A tip is way more voluntary than something like a bribe. I mean, especially when it's backed by political force and pressure and the authority that these people have to make you pay for it in some way if you don't pay them a bribe. You can't easily leave a country, especially if you're born in the developing world, and go to somewhere where there's not rampant bribery. However, you don't have to eat at a restaurant and pay a server a tip.
Yes, that's true, except where it's not. Maybe this is different in other parts of the country, but here, most of the time, if you have more than 6 people in your party, there is a mandatory tip that is put onto your bill. So it might feel like it's voluntary because, hey, you know, you get to choose to pay it, but the option besides that is not paying your bill. So I don't really view it as a voluntary thing in that case.
Nobody's holding a gun up to your head and saying, eat at this restaurant or eat at any restaurant, right? You have options for that. But they are holding a gun to your head and saying, fill out this paperwork and you're subject to my rules and you have to give me a bribe as well.
So I think the only comparison you have with a tip, of course, coercion is a big issue, but the comparison you have with a tip is that it's embedded in the culture and in all economic transactions. And you have to realize that these bribes are not just paid to the police or to the bureaucrat who's approving your application. They're paid to every person involved in every transaction you make. You get your refrigerator repair person to come in, your meat supplier, your ophthalmologist, your kid's teacher, your kid's soccer coach, whatever it might be. And they all take bribes. And in fact, bribes are how you do it. It's almost inevitable because people are not getting paid any other way. The bottom line here is that while it is completely corrosive by perverting all of the economic incentives and feedback loops for price, it's also so embedded in the culture that you can't really solve it with technology. People have tried. Certainly, there's entire movements in countries like India to fight corruption, and it's so difficult that even the people who want to fight it and are very much against it and committed to not paying bribes wears you down eventually. You know, you just can't function in that society without succumbing.
So another thing is, of course, the fees, right? There's the 1 to 10% fee that's applied by Safaricom, which owns the technology and that enables M-Pesa and basically is M-Pesa. But in addition to that, there's a 10% tax that's been put on these transactions by the Kenyan government, and also the Kenyan government routinely inflates their currency. Because if I'm correct here, M-Pesa is not a currency unto itself, rather it's a transmission mechanism and like a kind of wallet for the local currency. Is that right?
Yeah, that's my understanding.
If I understand where you're going with that, then Bitcoin would at least provide a technological solution to the issue of inflation.
Well, yeah, there's that part of it, but actually I'm looking at it from a different perspective. On this show, we spend a lot of time focusing on what the U.S. government is going to do about Bitcoin. But looking at a situation like Kenya, doesn't it seem like the Kenyan government is really, really, really going to hate Bitcoin because it provides competition? It's very difficult for them to tax. Again, it goes back to the competition thing, because by offering an alternative to a currency that is inflating at a substantial rate, it means that people are more likely to switch from the currency that's losing value to the currency that's gaining value and is cheaper to use overall. So, I mean, don't you think there's going to be some aggression coming from the Kenyan government if a change to like this was made?
Absolutely, but I don't think that change is very easy. There's another issue that we've kind of skirted, which is M-Pesa or systems like that could be implemented throughout sub-Saharan Africa, throughout Southeast Asia. There's certainly a need for them. So why haven't they been? That's an interesting question. Why isn't M-Pesa being used more broadly? Why aren't similar systems being used more broadly throughout sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia? And the answer, I think, is rather instructive here. It has to do with two factors. One is that Safaricom had a very massive deployed base of users and therefore was able to introduce this simultaneously to a volume of users that was sufficient to sustain a parallel economy from the get-go. So you have mass adoption at a level that creates simultaneously enough buyers and sellers to launch a market. It's very difficult to do that chicken and egg solution where you simultaneously have enough buyers and sellers within the locality to make a currency viable. And that's one of the reasons why M-Pesa hasn't taken off in other countries, or similar systems haven't taken off despite efforts to do so. And it's also one of the reasons why I don't think Bitcoin adoption is that easy or will happen that fast in some of these countries. There's a lot of prerequisites that go into Bitcoin adoption beyond just, hey, it's useful and I can put it on my cell phone.
It's almost like you need mass awareness before you can even approach the question of adoption. Because if people don't know about it, then it almost doesn't matter for the initial users because it's not useful to them. Just like a language isn't useful if you're the only one that speaks it in your country.
The network effect cuts both ways, which is if the network is too small, then there's no value added when you join it. And especially in the case of currency, the value of the currency is only based on the expectation that somebody else will be willing to accept it in a transaction. So that requires two things. It either requires a mass adoption where you are almost guaranteed that other parties will accept your transaction, or it requires you to adopt the currency for reasons other than transacting. And so with Bitcoin, what we saw is the first 3 years, the people who adopted Bitcoin were not really into it for transactions per se, or for the value per se, but more on ideological reasons. And that created sufficient volume and sufficient market growth so then it could start attracting people who are interested in using it as a currency. You know, it's essentially an ideological political movement that turned into a currency. Can't really bootstrap it like that in a developing country because there are much more pragmatic considerations.
Good afternoon. Stanislav Sholunov. You can call me Stas. I'm the CTO of Open Garden. A few of the things that I've done in the past was transport protocol work and QS work at Internet 2 and the design of a new congestion control in BitTorrent, which currently is responsible for somewhere about 1 in 6 bytes on the Internet, about 15% maybe.
So your background is really all about decentralized systems then?
Well, you could say that, yes.
So how did you find yourself going into mesh networks created by cell phones?
I was interested in creating mesh networks before there was the term mesh network. I was interested in making better routing, but there was not really yet a technology that would allow to connect devices in an ad hoc manner in, say, 2001. What you need are devices with heterogeneous wireless capabilities. And smartphones are the platform that allows to do that.
Now, when you say heterogeneous wireless capability, can you explain that?
On a phone, you have multiple wireless technologies. You have your 3G or 4G, you have Wi-Fi, you have maybe Wi-Fi Direct, you have Bluetooth, you have maybe NFC. And all of these things can be used to interconnect devices. And you can be using simultaneously multiple networks at the same time. And that's what allows to build this additional capability. The phone may be on 4G, but if there is another phone nearby that also is on its own carrier network, you might connect them locally using Wi-Fi Direct and create new capacity. These are our phones. And I am perhaps using my phone less than 1% of the time for data transmission. Same for you. So when I'm getting something from the internet, I can get it faster if I can go through both exits and more reliably.
You're saying that even though you might be connected in one capacity with one of those technologies, since each phone has multiple communication means and has the ability to use each one independently, then you can have interconnections that are completely separate from the upstream or downstream to the internet in this case. Is that right?
Exactly. So what Open Garden does, we create all sorts of wireless connections. We support Bluetooth, Wi-Fi Direct. We aren't particularly concerned about the specific underlying technologies. So we will create these wireless connections between devices whenever they are nearby, wirelessly, seamlessly for the user. The user doesn't need to worry about establishing them. The user doesn't need to open the app. Once connected, devices will access the internet collectively using whatever internet capacity they together have. This produces better statistical multiplexing. This gives everybody faster speed, better coverage.
That's really interesting. Have you touched the router space at all, or is it entirely about phones?
We leverage existing infrastructure and things that already exist and can be used. We address the mass market. So we want the kind of adoption that successful peer-to-peer applications have, not just addressing small audience of people who are willing to flash a new ROM to their Linksys, but people who can install a mobile app. And there are a lot more people who can install a mobile app. We currently support Android, Windows, and Mac. The computers also have ability to use multiple networks at once these days. We have dual Wi-Fi radios in many computers, and additionally we have Bluetooth.
Let's take a step back for a second. Open Garden, how did this come about? You said that you've been interested in mesh networks before they were called mesh networks and before the technology was there to do it. What occurred to incite the creation of Open Garden?
Misha and I got together about 2010, and the enabling technology for Open Garden is the smartphone. The computer inside everybody's pocket with multiple radio interfaces that makes Open Garden possible and interesting. Before the smartphone, the density of mobile laptops, for example, was not sufficient to make a difference for internet access through other devices. And when you are at home or at the office and your laptop is on local Wi-Fi, the need for internet access is less acute. The need for internet access is the most acute the worse your internet connection is. And generally, mobile situations, travel, being on mobile networks is where your need for better internet access faster and in more places is the most visible.
So you started in 2010. What has the journey been? Are you out in the wild with this now?
When we started, we wanted to first test the waters with a minimal viable product. So what we did was release an app that simply provided tethering. Just let you turn your phone into a mobile hotspot. We wanted to see what would be the uptake. We didn't do anything to promote this app, and it required you to root your Android phone. So it was addressed to a small audience of people capable of rooting their phone, and there was no marketing. By the time we had 500,000, we knew that we were onto something. We thought that people want this. So we started full-time work with Greg Hazel and Misha Benolio on making this current app, the real Open Garden Mesh Networking app. We've launched it at TechCrunch Disrupt in New York in 2012. The first 3 weeks, we got 100,000 downloads. By now, the two apps together have more than 2.5 million downloads. We like to release our software early so that we can see how it behaves in the wild. In general, development for Android is made difficult by the diversity of the Android ecosystem. Our software runs on devices that we've never seen and never will. So it's important to have a user base to be able to even develop the software.
You've got 2.5 million downloads. What does the use look like? I mean, is this working? Is this being used? Are there any geographies specifically where it's used, or is it more of like a ad hoc, as needed, people will get it and then they'll throw up a temporary net wherever they are? Or is it something that people walk around with on their phones and just are kind of using in day-to-day yet? Or are we to that point?
It's a particular situation where Open Garden today makes probably the biggest difference is tablets, particularly 7-inch tablets. People with a Nexus 7 or a Samsung Galaxy Tab without a 3G connection and a highly portable tablet are in a strange position, right? You have this device. It can go in your coat pocket. It can go, if you carry a purse, in your purse. It's really portable, but it is practically useless without an internet connection, and it doesn't have a 3G modem. And even if it did, it would cost $120, probably extra, and you would need to pay $20 a month to be able to use the internet from it. What Open Garden does is basically give you the benefit of having a 3G connection on your tablet for free. Because if you have an Android tablet, chances are you also have an Android phone. And you probably carry it with you at least as much as you carry your tablet.
The Android phone provides the connectivity for the tablet, and you only need to carry one internet-connected device in order to benefit on both.
Correct.
So even though this is a mesh network building tool, what it's being used for now is to build little personal. I mean, it's not even really mesh. It's more like a wireless tether or something.
The experience is far better than using wireless tethering. The experience of using wireless tethering requires you to take out your phone, go into settings, tap more, go into tethering, turn it on, go to your tablet now, connect to the right network, and when you're done, remember to turn off the tethering hotspot on your phone, otherwise your battery will be dead in 2 hours. With Open Garden, you use the internet like you normally do. You take your tablet and you use it for whatever it was you were going to use it, instead of fiddling with settings on your phone.
Does it have an impact on battery life in the same way that the wireless tether would?
Lower than wireless tethering.
The name Open Garden, you guys are not an open source software project, are you?
Our main app is currently not open source.
Is that where you... Well, it was confusing to me. When I first started talking to Paige about Open Garden, I assumed that it was open source. Do you have intentions to make it open source, or is this aimed to be a proprietary platform?
Greg and I have created open source software currently used by 250 million people in the form of the BitTorrent transport library. We're interested in making open source software widely available and successful. We've also created open protocols, several between the two of us, by now standardized. The application Open Garden is not open source. It's open in the sense of anybody being able to join the network. It's a garden that anybody can walk into. Hopefully it's open windows don't confuse people similarly. I'm expecting to be able to get the source for the window. But we are interested in open source in general and how we can make Open Garden more successful using it. But we're not yet prepared to discuss anything about our future moves with open source and Open Garden.
Fair enough. On the show, we have a focus on Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. It's not just Bitcoin, but it's cryptocurrencies and kind of the things that they enable. And one of the things that we've been talking about on and off with regards to mesh networks or Tor nodes, or there's a variety of situations. In your tablet phone scenario, that's one person who is gaining benefit from utilizing one service that would normally be available on one device on two devices. So I see the value in it there. But with cryptocurrencies and automated contracts, basically, you can set it up so that individual nodes that provide internet connection or service within one of these mesh networks are compensated on a as used basis. And I'm wondering, have you looked at cryptocurrencies or Bitcoin for doing anything like this, or is it outside the scope of your project?
We are interested in exploring ways to limit free riding on the system. The system is at its most efficient when it doesn't deny people its service. It creates the maximum amount of value. That's generally good. That generally is how things should be. If you look at design of BitTorrent, partly it was successful because you can download even before you've uploaded. If there were more stops to being able to use the system, then fewer people would benefit from it. The problem, to the extent that it exists here, is preventing people who perpetually free ride from doing so. And for now, the main mechanism by which that is accomplished is the need for physical proximity. If you install Open Garden to be able to get connectivity from others, you also contribute by nature of the software, if you are internet connected at all. So there is a contract of mutual help by virtue of installing Open Garden. We have also thought about making credit ecosystem. It might convert to real currency or might not. And whether real currency is a cryptocurrency or another form of distributed currency or dollars is not really the interesting part. Conversion to real currency is, however, different from simply byte accounting, and byte accounting can well be sufficient. So we're not yet sure how we would approach this problem in the future. But for now, we, in practice, don't have that problem. If you install Open Garden today, nobody will follow you around trying to use your internet constantly.
So if someone wants to get involved with Open Garden or download the application, do you have a website?
Yes, of course. We are available from opengarden.com, and the app is also available in Google Play Store, where it's called Open Garden, just like you'd expect.
Do you have any intentions of rolling out to iOS devices, or is this going to be a strictly Android project?
We don't have current plans that we can disclose about iOS. Obviously, we're very interested in all platforms, not just Android, and we already have support for 2 desktop operating systems. But we have to focus our efforts somewhere, and that's where we've chosen to focus for now.
Stas, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Everyone knows that offline storage is the only safe way to store your Bitcoins. Now there's an easy, convenient, and secure way to make Bitcoin wallets for safe offline storage. With the Safe Paper Wallet Kit, you get everything you need to print Bitcoin wallets using your own PC. Store them in a safe deposit box, your home safe, or even your sock drawer. Anything's more secure than keeping them online. Get your kit now at safepaperwallet.com.
You're listening to Let's Talk Bitcoin, the premier audiocast providing news and insights that cover the rapidly evolving world of digital money. Our twice-weekly shows include analysis of late-breaking news, updates on key technical, business, and regulatory issues, and in-depth interviews with the key people driving the new digital economy. Let's Talk Bitcoin offers sponsors an attractive way to reach a targeted and savvy audience. For more information, email sponsors@letstalkbitcoin.com.
So to finish up, we return to the Genesis Block article. Should widespread adoption actually occur within Kenya, the effects could be tremendous, not just for Kenyans, but for the Bitcoin market as well. In 2011, Kenya's GDP climbed over $33 billion, with mobile payments comprising some $10 billion of that figure. Bitcoin's current transaction volume is roughly 20 million per day, or just over 7 billion per year. If Bitcoin were to replace Kenya's mobile transactions, the Bitcoin market liquidity would more than double. To date, Kenya's Bitcoin adoption has been muted, with approximately 1,300 downloads in the country with 41 million people total. But with all the pieces set to align over the next few years, it's only a matter of time before Bitcoin and Kenya find one another. So do we think that this is inevitable? I mean, pretty clearly there are advantages here, there are hurdles here. The conclusion here is that this is going to happen. What do we think about that?
I doubt it very much. I think while Kenya is very promising, I've often expressed the fact that there are multiple preconditions for bursty adoption of Bitcoin. You need technology, electricity. You need the utility of the currency over your local currency. And you also need to not have fear of arrested or shot for holding Bitcoin. And all of those things really become a big equation where at some point it reaches a tipping point and you have mass adoption. I think it's far more likely that you might see localities within places like Cyprus and Argentina having bursty adoption, Where the technology infrastructure is more developed, there's more consistent electricity, and it's more compatible with people's adoption of technology in general. So I don't see Kenya as the first place to do it, despite M-Pesa. The model, I think, is right.
But did anybody see M-Pesa coming out in Kenya? I mean, that sounds like something that sort of came out of the blue, perhaps. So maybe it could happen in Kenya. I'm not sure. I think it's interesting to think about what would happen if Bitcoin's market liquidity doubled. I mean, that's pretty huge, and it really puts it in perspective just how many people are transacting and trading Bitcoins, or could be potentially in Kenya, every day. I think that would increase the value of Bitcoin quite a bit, perhaps enrich some people in the developing world if they had gotten them early enough.
I think that's a great suggestion, but the actual adoption of M-Pesa was anything but organic or grassroots. It was a planned adoption from the carrier that already had 75% of the market of mobile telephony in the country. They were able to essentially turn on a 75% market share into a currency in one move. I think that would be a great model for adoption for other places, or even Kenya. If some corporation that already has an established user base creates a Bitcoin-derived currency, or Bitcoin itself, as either a rewards card or a in-app currency or an in-store currency or a loyalty card or something like that, and then from that basis bootstraps it as a general transactional currency, I think that's a good chance of happening. I really don't see how that kind of planned introduction compares to the grassroots organic adoption we've seen of Bitcoin.
The number I keep looking at is this 93% of Kenyan households owning mobile phones. I think that you're right about it being both a planned rollout and about the people who have the ability to implement and roll out something similar in Bitcoin have almost no incentives to do it. And I think that that kind of is the core problem we're going to come to in a lot of these places. Anywhere there is a monopoly on technology, like there is here, where the vast majority of people are all on this same one Safaricom network, then that basically means that until there's an actual reason to change that increases the profitability or offers some sort of advantage to the company rather than to the users, it's very, very unlikely it'll actually happen.
That's the other big advantage for Safaricom, is that they can charge a transactional fee. So why would they go to Bitcoin, which would essentially remove their ability to tap into that flow of money?
There is potentially a profit incentive for somebody if they can encourage people to adopt this technology that could really work out well for them as well. Not only would it provide an alternative to M-Pesa, which sounds like kind of monopolistic actually, but it would also increase the market liquidity and therefore I think the value of Bitcoin. So Bitcoiners have an incentive to help this happen, whether it's going to Africa and doing some activism or trying to get people interested in it, or making some kind of app that somehow can run on older phones. I'm not exactly sure, but maybe someone will take up the mantle on that.
Well, there are apps that run on older phones. There are a couple of services out there. One of them, I believe, is Phonacoin, and there have been some more that come out. They basically leverage SMS messaging, text messaging.
Coinapult does that too, can send a coin by SMS.
Yeah, exactly. So, no, I mean, I think you're right if we lived in a perfect world, but because we live in a world, I mean, clearly Safaricom doesn't have this monopoly there on technology, on these technologies, because the government hates them, right? They have it because they've partnered with the government and they've enabled them to essentially tax these transactions
bribes.
Otherwise. Well, I mean, it doesn't really matter what you call it. The point is that anytime you go into a situation where there's an entrenched power structure, like, for example, monopolies, be they government, be they technology, and you say, hey, what you're doing is great, but wouldn't it be better for your customers if you charge them less by using this more efficient technology? I bet you get major pushback. In some types of cultures where there might be violent repercussions for you. So it's just something to keep in mind, that change is great if it's change that benefits you, but a lot of times if it's benefiting you, it's at the expense of somebody else who's higher up the food chain, and that's not something that's real popular. So there's hope. Thanks for tuning in to episode 18 of Let's Talk Bitcoin. Whether you liked, loved, or hated the show, we want to know what you think. Please send all listener mail to mail@letstalkbitcoin.com. Content for this episode was provided by Stephanie Murphy, Andreas M. Antonopoulos, Stanislav Sholanov, and Joseph David. Music for the episode is provided by Jared Rubens. For links to his work, visit letstalkbitcoin.com/music. If you're an open source musician and think your work would fit in well with the show, please email adam@letstalkbitcoin.com. If you like what we're doing and want to support us with Bitcoin or Litecoin donations, please visit letstalkbitcoin.com for episode-specific addresses. If you've got a question you'd like answered on air, call us at 1-855-WE-TALK-BITCOIN. By the way, if you're still listening, you should know that Let's Talk Bitcoin is growing up, and I'm quietly looking for potential partners who are on the same page about truth in media and education. If you like what we're doing, are looking for a project, and have skills on the technical or business side of things, you may contact me at adam@letstalkbitcoin.com. Stay tuned.